Good afternoon. My name is William Malik. I'm the Vice President for Infrastructure Strategies with Trend Micro. I've been with Trend for 3 years, but I've been in IT for over 46 years. And most of that time, I've been involved with various aspects of what we now call infrastructure and operations, or from a software perspective, systems management tools. And the purpose of this talk is to essentially discuss what we need to do to support the infrastructure for cloud after we've migrated to cloud. This is important because, perhaps an illustration would be this little story. My doctor told me recently that I should improve my health by losing weight. And so I said, okay, how do I do that? And he gave me some advice, and it's very important advice, and I'm sharing it with you now. He said, if I should lose weight, the two things I really need to do are first, eat less, and second, exercise more. And I thought about that, and I said, yes, that sounds reasonable and a good way to lose weight. And then being an enterprise architect, I took a careful inventory of my core competences, and I realized that eating less certainly is something I can do, but exercising more isn't really a core competence of mine. And so I decided prudently, and in the interest of economic balance, to outsource it. I send a check to my health club every month for $75. I haven't lost one damn pound. Those guys aren't doing their job. Okay, the message is, if you outsource something, you don't eliminate your responsibility. And that's what we're going to be talking about. There is always something you're responsible for in the cloud. This chart, which was actually provided to us at Trend by Gartner, shows the increasing scale of what you're responsible for, depending upon what kind of third-party service you're buying. If you're buying infrastructure as a service, then you have to do everything. You have to assemble it. You have to put the security around it. You have to determine the authentication, the rules, the calibration, the settings, the amount you're allowed to absorb, and so on. It's all in your lap. But even if you go to the skinniest, most completely pre-managed technology, there's something you're going to be responsible for. And we want to take a look at those. And so the bulk of this presentation is going to consist of about 9 charts, each one of which discusses a systems management discipline that still remains active in cloud. We refer to hybrid cloud because most organizations have more than one. Sometimes they'll have an internal service, but very often we see people using multiple external services. To talk about systems management, rather than just list a bunch of disciplines, I'd like to remind our audience of 2 powerful works that categorize and organize the business of managing a data center. This is the COBIT model. This is from ISACA. It's been around since the late 1990s. I actually had a hand in developing version 3 so long ago. And what it shows is about 34 systems management disciplines of various kinds that you need to remain in control of if you're going to effectively manage a data center. The structure behind these is for each of these sets of services you offer. COBIT gives you what the inputs ought to be, what combines to make an effective, well-organized set of processes. There's even an accompanying capability maturity model scale that will allow you to determine how well or poorly you're doing that. What the outputs are, that is why you do this activity, what the subsequent downstream services that will rely on these outputs will do. And finally, most importantly, how you audit these. As if you come in as an IT auditor, a role I served in for a couple of years, you want to be able to look at the various systems management disciplines and say, how well is this being done? And if it is not being done well, not just assessing the maturity, but overall, are the inputs well defined? Is the process clear? Are the outputs well structured? If you do that well, then you have 2 benefits to the organization. The first is that you're going to be fairly efficient at what you're doing. But more importantly, because you've documented all of these processes, you will be able to analyze them for any glitches or errors or unnecessary steps or redundant information, processes that don't really have impact on the overall goals of the organization. So a COBIT model not only lets you know where you are, but it also gives you very good guidance as to where you want to go to improve efficiencies in those things that matter. Now, COBIT may not be to everyone's taste, and so the ITIL library has a set of volumes that talk about systems management disciplines. This is actually a chart taken from the BMC Corporation that talks about the systems management disciplines, but the ITIL libraries are available publicly and will help an organization, again, get a handle on what needs to be done. This focuses more than COBIT does on organizational issues, on skill sets, and on particular areas of concern for different types of enterprise IT. But it segues quite naturally, as does COBIT, into both the IT that you have in-house and the IT that you're acquiring, either buying or renting from third-party sources. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the various pain points for systems management in hybrid cloud. First, we'll talk about audit and governance. Here, the question that the executive team is asking is something like this. Is our data being managed fairly and legally everywhere we operate? That is, can we take a look at the information that our organization has custodial responsibility for and affirm that, in fact, we've got good separation of duties around it, that we are properly consolidating and integrating logs about changes to it, that we know who owns it, who acquires it, we know what our retention period is, we know what has to be disposed of and is done so properly and securely, and we want to make sure, as part of audit and governance, that if we need to go back and verify that a step was done, or if we need to revisit evidence, say in the case of a possible wrongdoing, that we have forensically durable evidence, that we've got good reason to trust what our historical record is. This was relatively straightforward in the old days when stuff was batch or transaction driven. With the advent of interactive and cloud, some of these processes have become somewhat loose. And with rapid application deployment, we now see that the environment in which a transaction took place is not something static or durable, but that the logs, the forensic evidence, has to include not only what the inputs are and what the outputs are, but also what the configuration of processes was in place. Now, even if the processing is done elsewhere, and the data resides on machines that are not owned by and housed in your own facilities, these questions persist. Audit and governance, in other words, remains a critical function even after you've outsourced. The reason I have these gauges on the right is to remind us that it is better to be generally right than precisely wrong. If you take a look at these two fuel gauges, you might say, the top one seems kind of vague, whereas the bottom one is just loaded with precision. But here's the problem. The bottom one is a gas gauge from an American automobile. And American automobiles for the past 10 or 15 years have put a consistent Y into the gauges. Manufacturers decided that American consumers are fragile and don't want to see the level in the fuel tank drop as soon as they leave the station after a fill-up. And so when you fill up a car in the US, the gas gauge will go to full, even though the level is much higher than that. And it won't begin to drop until you've consumed about a gallon of gasoline. So those hash marks, which if it were a 16-gallon tank would be 1 gallon apiece, those hash marks are in fact entirely fictitious. The gas gauge above, which comes from a European automobile, tells you what you need to know. How close am I to running out of gas? And the indicator of the little gas pump will light up and tell you you're, in fact, close to running out. That's all you need to know to manage that car's fuel supply correctly. So when you do audit and governance, don't gather everything from an audit perspective. because you'll get a lot of information that gives you a false sense of security because it is overly precise while being, in fact, weak on the information you truly need to know. The next thing we'll look at is DevSecOps. This involves two critical processes that are a new world for most IT organizations. The first is rapid deployment. Stuff comes in and out of production fairly quickly. There are new updates regularly, not just security patches, but actual functional enhancements, which means that the change in release process, the sign off to allow you to modify the production environment is incredibly simplified, but it should not be lost. You still need to have some mechanism to let folks who are responsible for the overall integrity of the IT environment know what changes are about to happen, what changes have happened, and that the audit and security folks are involved so you don't put something out there that provides a nice new feature but leaves people high and dry when it comes to the issues of maintaining the integrity of that environment. So DevSecOps, a lot of work has been written on it. In most organizations, it's pronounced DevOps. The sec is silent. But nonetheless, it still has to be there. And that doesn't mean you bring strangers into the organization. More importantly, it means that you bring knowledge about information security principles, about separation of duties, about authentication, about least need to know, about minimizing privileges into the development process, just simply as architectural principles. The next thing that you need to remain aware of when you migrate to cloud is the principle of there is no perimeter. There's no edge. The graphic here represents the Joshua's attack on Jericho, where the walls came down. Cloud doesn't have a perimeter. The phrase used currently for this is zero trust. I'm not a fan of that name. Obviously, if there were no trust, there would be no place to begin when it comes to defining authentication. We want to be able to authenticate, which means there has to be a trusted party involved. And after a process of authentication, usually involving some kind of pre-registration, you're then able to go forward with some minimal need to know and assume nothing more. For critical tasks, multi-factor authentication is mandatory. We've seen so many data breaches that were caused simply by letting administrative privileges be available to anybody who knew the right password. These days, that means that a simple, constant attempt at different passwords will eventually succeed. Multi-factor authentication is crucial. Zero trust, the idea of there is no such thing as a perimeter. You can't by default assume that because somebody is on your network, they belong there and they should have all the privileges associated with that. So here again, separation of duties, even though sometimes the people you're concerned with are not part of your organization. Question, have you harmonized your security policies with your providers? Will they tell you when a key person has left the organization? Will they tell you when a breach happens in a timely fashion? Understand that when you're dealing with a third party, the only recompense you're going to have is eventually momentary. They breach your data, and so they will give you a discount on next month's payment. For some organizations, that may not be enough, but there's nothing more you would legally be able to do. So again, consider who is inside your organization and what privileges they have. I'm going to talk about identity management in a couple of ways here, because first we have the identities of individuals, and then we have the identity of technologies and technology paths. The examples here are to remember, most importantly, that identity management involves governing the access of individuals to resources, and it is a non-trivial process. In the top left, we have a picture. This is not a live picture of a driver's license. And the reason I have it there is to remind me of a story when I moved from Massachusetts to New York. I got a job working at IBM. I registered to vote in New York. Now, here's a conundrum. For a period of 2 months, I was a legal voter in New York while I had a legal driver's license from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. How is this legal? Well, it turns out that when you move in the United States, you have 60 days to get your driver's license updated. Now, in many organizations, people consider identity to be binary. And if there is any kind of an inconsistency, then that means that there is a flaw or defect. So a simple-minded, rule-based access control mechanism would say, well, if he's got a New York State voting reference, then he can't drive because he doesn't have a New York State driver's license. If he has a Massachusetts driver's license, then he can't vote. But you see, when a person takes a new role in an organization, it's not like they quit and then they came back. When a person takes a new role in an organization, some of the permissions they have will persist, their email address perhaps. Some will drop off immediately. You no longer have access to that particular resources. Yet others may persist until you complete a task. With the new role, you may get some new permissions granted right away, and yet you may have others that aren't going to take effect until you've completed some kind of training or some kind of additional background check or something. So a transition is a very, very complex process. That's why identity management is, in fact, such a complex set of technologies. I want to take a close look at role-based access control, if it's hard in a couple of places. The PTA on the right reminds me that our Parent-Teacher Association is set up in schools to allow the parents to have a voice in what's going on. The educators can observe but not participate. So here's a question. What happens when a teacher has a child who happens to be a student at that same university? Is that teacher allowed to be in the PTA because they are actually a parent? Or is that teacher prohibited from being in the PTA because as a teacher, they shouldn't have the voice in the running of the organization? Well, it turns out that that has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. My point is that role-based access control breaks down when it hits the real world. It's simple if you have junior tellers who grow up and become tellers and then move on to senior tellers. But once you get into middle management, role-based access control collapses. The HIPAA rule in the US also emphasizes this. If I go into an emergency room, any doctor in that room has access to any information they need to provide me care unless I happen to be a doctor in that hospital, in which case there's a whole different set of protocols that take place when I am a patient in the emergency room. The point is that role-based access control is extraordinarily complex. At MIT, they attempted to do a complete assessment of role-based access control. They looked at grad students, instructors, TAs, tenure track, and administrative faculty. They had 17,000 people. They completed their role-based analysis, and they discovered they had 34,000 roles, and the average individual had 8. If the problem is 17,000, the solution shouldn't sound like 34,000. Successful role-based implementations usually have a small set of roles, fewer than 10. Roles like, am I a customer? Am I a manager? Am I an employee? Am I a third-party supplier? And stop there. And from then on, it's all going to have to be granted permission by an intelligent individual who owns the resource being sought after. Shadow cloud is an interesting one. We've talked about shadow IT for a long time. There's shadow OT. Shadow cloud comes about because it's just so darn cheap and available. I need something, and so I'm going to expense a trivial amount of cash to get a month's worth of access to a resource. The problem is that when you have transient cloud, this can become a vector for attack. I mean, not only is there a risk that your data may end up in somebody's private cloud with inappropriate permissions around it, but more importantly, that cloud could be actually there accidentally. You know, I didn't know I was getting cloud when I signed up for this movie subscription. It could be an unintentional side effect, meaning you have a leak, or it could be, in fact, part of an attack. You were phished and someone on your behalf set up cloud, and they're using it as a point of egress for data exfiltration. So when you go to cloud, you actually have increased your attack surface. You need to be aware of which cloud services are being used in real time. You need to know what data is going there. And the whole domain of cloud access security brokers, in fact, covers that. Now, one of the concerns I have with the definition of CASB as it now stands is that a CASB formally must include an identity management component. To me, that's a non-starter and disqualifies the concept because, as we've seen in the previous chart, identity management is non-trivial and complex, and it needs to cover the whole organization. You're not going to buy a cloud access security broker and then take its identity management component and extend it across your entire enterprise. Better to have the components of a cloud access security broker that do not require identity management in that product and have integration points that allow your cloud security to link up with whatever corporate enterprise-wide identity management tool you have. Image persistence is a tricky one. This is new to cloud, and it's actually going to get significantly worse in the era of 5G. This image is taken from a presentation on vulnerabilities in 5G networking. And it's, of course, it's future oriented because the major specification for 5G is going to be in the 3GPP's release 18. And release 18 hasn't even started yet. It probably won't be published until the end of 2022 or early 2023, which means developers of 5G technology will not be able to start building standards compliant 5G until 2023 or 2024. But with that in mind, there are pieces of it that have been rolling out since REL 15. And here what I want to focus on is on the middle and right. You'll notice there are a significant number of vulnerabilities associated with virtualization. We have virtual networking, we have virtual storage capabilities, and we have virtual applications. When a user of an app on a 5G phone traverses from one cell to another, their application stack isn't just something that's running on their phone. The phone is a set of APIs to a back-end service that has provisioned a stack of network, storage, and application and infrastructure, layers and layers of virtualization that were provisioned solely to service that particular application. And when you carry your cell phone to the next cell, that stack has to be torn down and reinstantiated at the next place. And remember, in 5G, we're talking about cells every 100 meters or so. The goal for 5G is to be able to support 1 million active devices in a square kilometer. That means, on average, an active device in every square meter of a city center. And as you traverse cells by walking around the block, you're going to be tearing down and reinstantiating those things. Now, we do have the technology to tear down and stand up virtual images. There's a second problem, which is the metadata around those images, the counters that keep track of what's the number of the image I've just put up, the virtual alignment of the storage and resources that have been used and have become free. That table itself will become, in the old days we called it gassy. In fact, the problem of garbage collection dates back to the very late 1950s. This isn't new. John McCarthy wrote a paper on Lisp garbage collection that got published in the first half of 1960. And it talked about the fact that as programs come and go, as subroutines are created and are finished, the residual storage, the metadata around those subroutines vanishes. But the place where the metadata was held is basically locked up and unallocated. In the 5G world, we're going to see the pace with which new images are created or torn down to go up by orders of magnitude. And that has implications for, the automation of the deployment of virtual capabilities. It has implications for the automation of the security around those things. No human being will be able to keep up with the pace at which new images are taken up and torn down. But it's the scratch pad. It's the associated tables that talk about what images are active and what are in play and which ones are reserved and which ones have actually been exhausted. It's those tables that will get overwhelmed by the volume of change. We've recently seen many instances where services that are global have rolled over. We had the 10-bit counter for weeks that caused some GPS satellites to fail in April of last year. We had a counter on utilization that caused some storage devices to fail when it rolled over after 2 billion milliseconds of utilization. We've seen it in network capabilities. We've seen tables exhausted in many, many environments. It's going to get significantly worse. So beware of that. Monitor those things. Understand that if you roll a counter, simply resetting it won't help. It'll roll again. You need to be very careful about how you tend to solve these problems, because if you end up with 2 different names for the same item, or if with an item that has no name, your system has become, in an absolute philosophical sense, unmanageable. So image persistence, garbage collection, and the metadata handling is going to be a growing problem soon for cloud environments. Procurement and contract administration. How do you buy this stuff? How do you centralize buying? It's not build versus buy. It's build, buy, or rent. And how does procurement involve itself in the short-term rental of SaaS-type capabilities? You need to put a discipline in place that will allow people to make intelligent choices about what can and cannot be bought off the cuff. I'm not suggesting a bum of the month club. I'm suggesting an educational effort to try to correlate the buying habits of organizational units so that they make sense, so that they can be predicted. How do you assess what a good deal is? In some environments, CapEx may actually be better than OpEx. And that gets to the next one, which is skills, organization. You had a bunch of people who used to know how to run data centers. They don't have value because that function is, to the large part, outsourced. You're not doing capacity planning anymore. It's rendered moot by the fact that you have elasticity of demand. But if your guiding philosophy is that OpEx is always better than CapEx, then your team is going to ask, are consultants better than full-time staff? How do you manage corporate culture when you replace the soldiers with contract administrators? And how do supervisors maintain their beacon of organizational knowledge? What do they need to do to adequately manage performance of full-time and part-time employees? How do you go through the transition without awakening echoes of the tragic downsizings that took place in the 90s and early 2000s? What do? Prepare for identity-centric security. Make a gap analysis between what your I&O function and governance procedures are done as seen by the first-line managers that are doing it and the senior executives that expect it's there. Make sure you align your procurement team with what's going on for buying, both for SaaS, informal data centers. Try to bring them into the fold. And finally, get a software asset management database in place. Know what tools you have. Know where they came from, their provenance. You're using third-party software. You're using stuff from open source laboratories. That stuff itself uses subordinate capabilities from open source libraries. You need to know where all of that comes from. Now, I have attached a few references, but at that point, I've come to the end of my formal talks, and I'd like to be able to address any questions that you might have.